So, okay. So now the proper welcome. Welcome, thank you for sharing your Saturday evening with us. And I'm here to introduce the speaker for this evening. So to my left is Rolando Aguilera. And Rolando grew up in Guelph, Ontario, to parents from El Salvador. And there he attended Catholic primary and Catholic schools. And during those same years, Rolando's mother actively cultivated a curiosity in the spiritual through attendance at the Universal Christian Gnostic gatherings. So a number of spiritual influences since childhood. And after his childhood, while attending the University of Guelph, there he majored in political science and minored in Spanish language and literature. He also there began to study the Bahá'í faith, and since 2002 has been a member of the Bahá'í community. Rolando also has a master's degree in Latin American literature and holds a Juris Doctor from Osgood Law School. And presently, Rolando works in the Indigenous Justice Division with the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General. And he's been married to Maral Moradipur, who is myself, for 15 years. And we have two children, Rafael Shaheen and Kumas Isalko, and they're also watching this presentation with all of you. So that's my intro, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rolando.
Thank you very much, Maral, for that lovely introduction. Maral has a lot of dirt on me, so I thank her for being circumspect. And but I want to just again echo Maral's appreciation for you being with us this evening. Some of you I've invited myself, and I know you come from a long way, so to speak. We have friends from the United States. We have friends from Toronto. We have friends from British Columbia. So I'm very grateful for you coming with us and being with us. Yes, so let's just get into it. The title of the presentation is From Darkness to Light, and you likely have seen the description of the presentation, but I'm going to jump into it here to provide a little bit of a sense of where we're going to go this evening. So I'm going to provide us with some general framing about what I'm talking about tonight and what I'm not talking about, just so there's no misgivings, or I'm not trying to bite off more than I can chew in this presentation. I'm going to go through a couple of things that really undergird and have motivated my journey, spiritual journey that Maral alluded to in the bio. Some of those which include the Civil War in El Salvador, and a couple of very poignant moments that stick out in my mind during my formative years that I've given titles here: Luck of the Draw, Put Your Hand Down. I'm going to get into some more biographical elements of my family, specifically my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Mama Mari, whose name is here, my mother, Violeta, and then wrap things up with a reframing. So bookend the conversation. So let's move on. The title of this presentation could have been different than what it was. It's called From Darkness to Light, Navigating Difficulties through Rational Spirituality, but it really could have been From Lightness to Dark, to Lightness again, to Dark again, in a circular fashion, because I think that's generally, if we experience a journey of searching for truth, we come, we explore, we endeavor, we come up against hardship. Maybe we get bogged down and we get up and try again. The title will make sense, I think, as we go along, so I won't belabor that point there. So what is the darkness I'm referring to? I'm going to be talking about superstition. I'm going to talk about dogma and blind imitation, and moving from these sort of frames of interpretation of reality to one that is liberated from these frameworks. And the reason that I call them darkness, you will see momentarily. But really the focus of the presentation is exploring these instances of superstition and dogma throughout the course, looking at these anecdotes in my life and following through with an analysis of these instances based on the teachings that I received from my parents and their parents in turn. The kind of superstition that I'm not going to be talking about is the kind of superstition that we're familiar with in maybe in television news, the stories that we were told when we were kids, you know, throwing salt over your shoulder if it spills on the table, you know, that a black cat is bad luck, or opening an umbrella inside is going to bring you bad luck as well. I'm not talking about that kind of superstition. The superstition and dogma and blind imitation that I'm talking about are really the deep-seated mental frameworks that we inherit from the previous generations in a very unthinking fashion, and that we in turn, through our behavior and our actions, use those as a bias upon which we interact with the world. I hope that becomes clear as we go through. So we're going to go from that kind of superstition, the darkness, to light, and looking at those family teachings that I referred to, seeking the truth, and truth being a metaphor, light being a metaphor for truth. Final disclaimer before we get into the presentation. This is really my own perspective, my very subjective and humble perspective on phenomena of my life that happened to me. And I want to add an extra level of disclaimer because I see my father's on the call, Alberto Aguilera, and my dear cousin, Maria Rosales, is also on the call. So some of the phenomena that I'm going to be talking about, they also have deep insight into and may have very different interpretations of what happened. So I offer that very humbly. The next level of disclaimer is that I'm going to be talking about some teachings of the Baha'i faith, and I'm not an authoritative interpreter of these writings. They're just my experience with those writings and my offering to this particular subject at this time. So I want to start off by framing. I'm going to do two kinds of framing. I'm going to center our discussion on quotes about what superstition and blind imitation and the detriment that they have on our individual lives, but also on our relationships with one another, and therefore on society. And then I'm going to talk about the very particular kind of framing, which is, who I am, where I come from, and some important figures in my life. So I want to start off with this quote. I'm going to hand it over to my very able friend, Mara Muradipur, and she's going to read it for us.
Know ye that God has created in man the power of reason, whereby man is enabled to investigate reality. God has not intended man to imitate blindly his fathers and ancestors. He has endowed him with mind, or the faculty of reasoning, by the exercise of which he is to investigate and discover the truth, and that which he finds real and true he must accept. He must not be an imitator or blind follower of any soul. He must not rely implicitly upon the opinion of any man without investigation. Nay, each soul must seek intelligently and independently, arriving at a real conclusion and bound only by that reality. The greatest cause of bereavement and disheartening in the world of humanity is ignorance based upon blind imitation. It is due to this that wars and battles prevail. From this cause, hatred and animosity arise continually among mankind.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to leave that with you. Hopefully it'll percolate as we go through some little bit of history. So I want to start off with a picture. This is my mother. It was taken in 1993. That's my birthday, actually. I didn't realize that when I picked that I was turning 11 years old. And of course, it's the only mother I had in this life. I don't want to go on, but central figure in my development as a person and my spiritual development specifically. The next picture is of a younger version of my father. This would have been shortly after the birth of his firstborn son, who the lady to his right is his mother, Hilda Cardona, and my brother is Alberto, and he's months old in that picture. To his right and our left is Santiago Aguilera, who is my grandfather and his father. And so I'm including my father there because some of the teachings that I'm going to talk about emanate specifically from his experience as a young boy and man in El Salvador, and the way he transmitted to me. So now we get into a little bit of the history that I was talking about in the biography that would have sent out, or the abstract. If this scene may be familiar to you, but its interpretation, maybe this is probably exclusive viewing. That little baby in there is me. I was raised, not necessarily raised as a Catholic, but I was brought up in a Catholic environment, Catholic country, El Salvador. Christianity, obviously a big force in shaping societal life. That picture was taken when my grandmother and a couple of aunts of mine had been up here in Canada, and they were worried out of their minds that I was going to wake up and cry and scream and make the play a disaster. But they prayed and prayed and prayed that I wouldn't wake up, and I did, which was an anomaly because apparently I was a terror as a child to go to sleep. So that was my first foray into theater and Catholic iconography. This is myself as a 7-year-old, after having received First Communion, quite handsome clothes. I don't think I've dressed as smart since that day. So good on this boy's parents for dressing him right for the day. And this was when I was about 15, maybe, no, it would have been 14 years old when I received the sacrament of confirmation as a Catholic young man, transitioning to adulthood and taking responsibility for my own spiritual development. The lady there with me is my dear aunt, Maria Rosales' mother, who was acting as a kind of like sponsor, godmother, who would be charged with facilitating and continuing my spiritual development. This is all part of the framing. Okay, so I'm going to transition now to some very important instances in my life, teachings from my parents that helped lay the groundwork to confront moments of dogmatism and blind imitation. I call this slide Civil War at a Distance because I remember very clearly in the early 90s when the end of the Civil War was happening, and my parents were, we were growing up in Guelph, Ontario, that whenever the news would come on what was going on back home, they would rush to the television and be glued to it. And that level of attention and importance attached to the information and the images struck me. I would follow them to the living room and try to find out what was going on. And I remember turning to my parents, like, why are they fighting? And trying to understand why we were in this country, in Canada. And I remember, and I tell this story all the time. My father turned to me and said, they are fighting a war because they couldn't resolve the problems that they inherited from colonial times. The extremes of wealth and poverty, the violent repression of the desire of the masses of the people for a sense of dignity, a living wage, to live in security, hasn't been resolved. And that legacy goes all the way back to the colonial period. Now, I'm very much tailoring my words here to the audience and the purpose of this presentation, because my father did not hold back in the kind of language and descriptions of the kind of abuses that our ancestors sustained as a result of the arrival of the Spanish colonizers in the Americas. They were very strong words. I had never heard them ever before in any other context. And they really instilled in me a sense of the kind of injustice that took place and the intergenerational consequences of that legacy. Sharing you with some images here of, you can see a very young boy brandishing a machine gun, and very stylized in a way, but a very stark reality that would ensue, and the outcome of that war, brutal. So with that, I want to transition to a segment that I call Luck of the Draw. I was attending Catholic school, elementary school, St. Bernadette's primary school in Guelph. It doesn't exist anymore. It was torn down to make way for a high school that I attended as well. And I call this Luck of the Draw. That person there on the right side, that's me reciting a poem that I had to present. The reason I'm showing that picture is because what I'm about to describe happened in this room. And we were doing an activity. This was in grade 5. We were doing an activity, and that activity was designed to illustrate, why is there inequality in the world? Why are some people born into wealth and some people are born into poverty? We were lined up outside of the classroom, and the teacher was at the front of the door. Each child would have to pass by the teacher and pick a straw from the teacher's hand and proceed to the classroom. The children with the smaller straws had to sit in a certain area, and the children with the larger straws, the longer straws, would sit in another. Those with shorter straws didn't have all the benefits that the ones with the longer straws had. They didn't have access to water or certain wealth, or couldn't do certain things, while those who were at the location with the longer straws had all the benefits, were able to move around the room more freely, etc. At the end of the exercise, after hard feelings had been developed between the haves and the have-nots, clearly, the question was posed, why do some people end up at the table with the small straws and some people go with the longer straws? And there was silence fell over the room. Nobody answered until such time as the teacher intervened and said, it's the luck of the draw. It is a matter of fate. And that's when my parents' teachings kicked in. So at that very moment, I remembered what my father had told me. It didn't seem from what Papa Ociel taught me that things were luck of the draw. As a matter of fact, it seemed like the haves and the have-nots were a product of systemic injustice. It seemed to me that because these injustices had not been rectified generation after generation, we in the present had inherited those problems and responded in ways that only exacerbated divisions between peoples. A second level of analysis that helped me navigate this moment was the teachings of Monsignor Romero, who was Catholic Bishop of San Salvador during the time preceding the Civil War, but at the beginning of the Civil War, again, as taught through my parents, my mother and my father. Monsignor Romero and many Catholic priests during that time in Latin America offered an interpretation of the Bible that was a preferential, quote unquote, a preferential option for the poor. That the Bible and Catholicism and Christianity really had to be ministered to the masses who had been deprived of a basic sense of dignity. Monsignor Romero tragically paid with his life for teaching such a ministry. And just to put a point on it, that he wasn't always like this. This man, Monsignor Romero, was very much a product of Vatican II. For those of you who come from the Catholic background, went to Rome and studied, was indoctrinated, and I'm not saying that in a pejorative sense, but truly received the doctrine according to the canon of Catholicism. And only was it when repression started picking up in El Salvador that he said, effectively, I have no choice here. These people just want a basic, sense of dignity, food to eat, clean water, a home, and they're not being offered that. And so he really abandoned his seclusion in conservatism, Christian conservatism, and went to sort of mass popular teaching of religion. So these sort of frameworks assisted considerably. And last sort of element that I received from my parents also was this teachings of Christian Gnosticism that they had exposed me to early on. My father had taken up Christian Gnosticism or Gnosticism back in El Salvador, and my mother had taken it up upon arrival in Canada, and she was taking us to these lessons. And the Christian Gnostics would interpret the Bible not in literal terms, but in metaphorical terms. So that when, for example, take the example of Jesus eliminating the merchants from the temple, you could take a literal interpretation and read that story as a historical fact. The Christian Gnostics would turn around and tell you that represents the elimination of avarice, greed, and the accumulation of wealth at the expense of all others, that it's an internal process, that really it's about the individual doing his or her best to free themselves from these shortcomings in the human condition. So going back to the example, I did not find that my teacher and the teachings that I received at school, I found them a weak explanation of social phenomena. As an 11-year-old, 12-year-old, it was very hard for me to accept that systemic inequalities is a matter of fate. And that as a true believer, our responsibility is simply for pray to the poor, give them, charity once in a while, and that's it. Put your hand down, or being Mesoamerican in Canada. This is the next anecdote I wish to share with you in trying to grapple with superstition, blind imitation. The picture you're looking at is my grandmother, Mama Mari, who I'll talk about shortly. The woman on her right, or the girl on her right, is Maria Rosales, who's with us here today, fashion icon back then and today. And the crazy guy on her left is me. I share this picture because the story I'm about to tell you is from that time. So put your hand down happened to me in grade 7. I was in grade 7 and we had a number of guest speakers. Turns out now that I realize who they were most likely elders or knowledge keepers from an Indigenous community up here in Ontario. I couldn't tell you which community they're from because that just escapes me at the moment. They finished their presentation and again, recalling what my parents had taught me, who we are and where we come from. My parents always taught us that we have Indigenous ancestry and the Spanish came and colonized us. The speakers finished their presentation and they said, anybody else in this room is Indigenous or has an Indigenous ancestry? And I eagerly put up my hand. And my teacher said, put your hand down. And I looked with shame and a bit of humiliation, looking at my teacher and like, you're not Indigenous. And I just said, I think it's hard, it's a long time ago. I think I said, yes, I am. Of course I am. So I want to explore, again, this happens in the context of my Catholic education, my Christian upbringing. This was a Catholic school. And I'm trying to reckon with the fact that my parents tell me who I am, and then this man is telling me who I'm not. In order to situate this discussion, I want to take us back to the middle of the 16th century.
Don't get too stuck.
And specifically to an event called the debate at Valladolid, which is in Spain. This debate was summoned by the King Carlos at the time. And it took place between the man on the left, Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, and the man on the right, Fray Bartolomé de las Casas. Fray Bartolomé de las Casas had written in years prior of what he referred to as the destruction of the Indies, and specifically the Caribbean. This debate, the premise of this debate was to discuss the humanity of indigenous peoples in the Americas. Note that the people having this debate and for whom the debate is, who in whose presence the debate is being had. This debate is being had between intellectuals and religious men on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And the essence of the debate is this: if indigenous peoples are human, if they have the capacity to reason, then they ought not receive the sword and be submitted to Catholicism by force. The one in favor for the use of force was Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda. And he claimed that indigenous peoples were indeed not rational and that their enslavement was justified, therefore. Bartolomé de las Casas, on the other hand, said, no, indigenous peoples do have the capacity of understanding and reason, and therefore should be benefactors of civilization. Okay. Now, I'm going to show a couple of slides here that are pretty strong. So, but the following renditions are from Bartolomé de las Casas' book called The Destruction of the Indies. And what you're going to see are images of the representations of what he described. So what you're seeing here is a representation of some of the things that he described. So this is one of the descriptions. They would erect long giblets and bind 13 of the Indians at one time in honor and reverence, they said, of our Redeemer and the 12 apostles, and put firewood around it and burn the Indians alive. Okay, these are some of the things that he saw and described, and that he petitioned the king to have cease. I'll go on to the next slide. This again is from an extract of the book. The Lord, and this is referring to one of the leadership of the indigenous communities. The Lord asked the Holy Father whether Christians went to the sky. The priest replied that they did, but only those who were good. And the cacique, the chief, then said that he did not desire to go to the sky, but rather down to hell, so that he would not be where they were. It would not see such cruel people. So I want to go back and maybe go a little bit higher. I felt an affront to my personhood, having been told that I wasn't indigenous. Now, as an older person and looking back and learning the things that I've learned through my work and my own personal study, I realize how even more profound these comments are. Indigenous peoples were Christianized in the Americas on the basis that they were not human. That was justified. This goes back to even what was now referred to as the doctrine of discovery, that the king would recognize claims to territory in exchange for indigenous peoples being converted to Christianity. And conversion here means by force. So our relationship with Christianity and Catholicism, its genesis, its inception, its baptism is through blood. And when we come to express and attempt to express our relationship with the beyond, it is laden with a lot of these underlying notions of savagery, barbarism on one hand, and civilization and superiority on the other. All of what I just spoke is not what my parents taught me. They taught me through their lessons that I was a worthy human being, that I was a capable human being, and that I had the capacity and responsibility to help my neighbors and those in need, and that I should draw on my experiences to sympathize and empathize with those around me. Mama Mari's lead. Now I get to introduce to you my grandmother, and Maria's grandmother, and I believe I had another relative on the call, but I can't see her on the screen. So Mama Mari Sanchez here in the middle with the dress, that's my mother's mother. My brother is who she's embracing, and that's my aunt who has her arm around me, Tia Mirni. We're in Panama there. I'm going to speak to a little bit about Mama Mari's example and the teachings that have like laid a solid foundation for me. Mama Mari was, and it continues to be, she's 93. I saw in her discipline, reverence, and she taught me a lot about abandon. Now I'm going to just elaborate really briefly. When Mama Mari used to visit us in Canada, every night before we go to bed, I would go to her room and she would be praying. Every night would be praying in a soft voice. And I was so attracted to that. Naturally, she was my grandmother, so I probably anything she would be doing, I would probably want to be around her. But her prayers and her devotion at the end of the day, I wanted to sit beside her and know what she was doing. She would always be reading her Bible as well. And once in a while, I would open her Bible and I noticed that it was very, very like marked up, highlighted over and over again, every last page. The discipline in reading that Bible over and over and trying to understand it and apply it to her life, and the reverential attitude that she had towards prayer were impactful. Just on the premise of just looking at her and seeing her and what is she doing, trying to understand. That particular trip in Panama, we had taken a trip to an island, and a storm hit on the way back, and the boat was rocking like this from side to side. And I felt such a terror and panic. I truly believed that I was going to die. I was 9 years old. She brought me in close. She reassured me. She put my head on her lap and started singing a prayer. I could sing it to you now, but she started singing this prayer over and over again, over and over again. And as soon as we got into that rhythm, I totally forgot that the waves were there. That instilled in me a sense of, again, that sense of abandon and assurance. Mama Violeta teaches on unity. Now, this is coming back to my mother. Violeta, the woman in that picture, my mother, laid a crucial foundation for my understanding about eliminating prejudices and dogma. Mama Violeta would always say, Rolando, all religions come from the same God. They all come from one source. It doesn't matter. One calls itself this and one calls itself that, but they all come from the same source. And she would be saying this at all times of the day. She'd be washing dishes. We'd be talking about different issues. And she would say, disabuse yourself of this idea that these religions are different. They all come from the same source. And I would just listen and say, yeah. So little did I know the full degree, the impact that this would have on my life and my ability to relate to people from different religious backgrounds, engage with them, learn from them, try to understand them. All of these were really transmitted by my mother, this specific lesson on unity. So I've come to the end of some key instances that I wanted to share with you and contrast them with the teachings of my parents, the example of my grandmother, and my extended family, my aunts you saw in those pictures, and the different teachings, things that over the course of my life helped me confront these kind of dogmatic explanations of reality about why poverty and wealth exist, and basically there's nothing we can do about it, and throw our hands up in the air, or that very subtle but yet profound idea that indigenous peoples from the Americas were uncivilized, and that the only way that they could come into civilization was through Christianity, which we don't talk about very often, came at the end of a sword. I want to transition here back to the beginning. about superstition. And I want to share this quote with you to broaden our discussion. So I'm going to get Marl, you could read it.
If a man would succeed in his search after truth, he must, in the first place, shut his eyes to all the traditional superstitions of the past. All religions themselves, respectively, the only guardians of the truth, and that, I'm sorry, did I miss something? All religions themselves, respectively, the only guardians of the truth, and that every religion is composed of errors. They themselves are right, all others are wrong. If all condemn one another, where shall we search for truth? All contradicting one another, all cannot be true. If each believe his particular religion to be the only true one, he blinds his eyes to the truth in the others. We should therefore detach ourselves from the external forms and practices of religion. We must realize that these forms and practices, however beautiful, are but garments clothing the warm heart and the living limbs of divine truth. We must abandon the prejudices of tradition if we would succeed in finding the truth at the core of all religions.
Yep.
In order to find truth, we must give up our prejudices, our own small, trivial notions. An open, receptive mind is essential. If our chalice is full of self, there is no room in it for the water of life. The fact that we imagine ourselves to be right and everybody else wrong is the greatest of all obstacles in the path towards unity, and unity is necessary if we would reach truth, for truth is one. Therefore, it is imperative that we should renounce our own particular prejudices and superstitions if we earnestly desire to seek the truth. Unless we make a distinction in our minds between dogma, superstition, and prejudice on the one hand, and truth on the other, we cannot succeed. When we are in earnest in our search for anything, we look for it everywhere. This principle we must carry out in our search for truth.
So I'm going to finish up here and stress or suggest that if we are successful on an individual or collective basis of freeing ourselves from the kind of baggage that informs our interpretation of reality, then the party just is getting started. We don't actually, that's not the finish line. That might in actuality represent the beginning of a long journey, because then comes the fun part. As we navigate and confront our problems, both individual and collective, we must now confront them wholeheartedly. There's nowhere to run. There is no superstition or conspiracy theory or crutch or metaphor that will save us. We have to confront the problems straight on. And sometimes that means when we attempt to confront that problem, we don't resolve it, then we get ourselves into more trouble. But I want to propose that this challenge is even accentuated even more in this day and age. With the proliferation of social media and the information age that we live in, it becomes more and more difficult to understand reality and come to a sense of common understanding when there is a proliferation of so much information and data. Again, that may be a daunting and sort of overwhelming thesis. Nonetheless, we are there. Some of the elements that I found in the Baha'i faith that assist in this process are two things. One is this principle of consultation, where as a collective or within the confines of our family, we come together, we identify a problem, we propose solutions, and through a prayerful attitude and a focus on, outside of ourselves, we come to a decision. After we make that decision, we wholeheartedly support it. And even if the decision in the short or long run, it turns out to be wrong, at least collectively, we've submitted to that decision and we can go about ways to rectify it. That's one that sort of can attenuate, if not resolve in some instances, the tendency of the individual to make hasty decisions based on emotion, the desire to resolve things and move past very quickly. When you're sitting in a room with a group of people or your family members trying to tackle a problem, it can get tense, it can get hairy, but nonetheless, you stay in the game, you see it through. And that's one element. Another element is this interpretation of prayer. One thing that I appreciate about the Bahá'í explanation of prayer is that it's not one based on exchange or bartering. So many times in my life, I've heard it say, oh, you need some money, just pray to God, or do such a deed and you'll get something in return, or whatever. Oh, I need $5,000 if I just pray, or if I give this thing, then I'll get something in return. That's not the Bahá'í interpretation of how prayer works. Prayer really is a process of centering oneself as a creation in supplication of the Creator and ridding oneself of ego. And that may mean, in the short or long term, you don't get what you want because it's not about you. Again, this is a very challenging thing, especially for my Catholic brothers and sisters who may, again, have been inherited this kind of interpretation of what it means to pray. But as you go down, you give yourself over to this concept, you realize how liberating it is, because it's not based on, you and God are not on equal terms where, hey, I'll give you $5 and you let me borrow your car for an hour. It doesn't work like that. So this really is a process of eliminating the ego and trying to find solutions in an objective and a rational way. Thank you very much. I hope that if I haven't been explicit in some instances, you've been able to make connections on your own, ask questions, consider some contradictions, and hopefully you have some questions for me that I can help address and resolve if there's any queries that you may have. But I'll hand it back to Marl because I think she was going to, did you want to start off?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, if we're going into the question and answer periods, should we, whoever's in?
Yes, so we can stop recording, right?
Yeah.